Do you own a digital camera? If so, do you know that you don't have to be a professional photographer to create much more professional looking photos? In this demonstration, I will explain the key components in order to create a much more professional looking photo, and I will demonstrate how to use these components. As I look to start my photography career, I have learned much from books, articles, and fellow photographers to get a better understanding on how to use a digital camera. Therefore, I believe that using a digital camera on the manual setting creates much more creative photos. As I stated earlier, photos are made up of many components. The first component is ISO. The next components are shutter speed and aperture. And finally, there's exposure. ISO is the first component many photographers adjust. ISO controls whether the photographer needs to use an external flash or not. Most photographers want to stay with a low ISO in order to create much more higher resolution photos. The higher ISO you go, the more grainy the photo will appear. In order to set the ISO, you go into your digital camera, go into the ISO section, and adjust it accordingly. Now that I have explained and demonstrated how to set up the ISO, I will move on to shutter speed and aperture. Shutter speed and aperture are the two most used components by photographers. Shutter speed allows photographers to manipulate the objects they are shooting. A slow shutter speed is often used to shoot objects such as water or liquid to create a much more smoother effect, whereas a fast shutter speed is used to capture objects such as cars or sporting events to keep the object they are shooting in focus. Aperture is used to determine what stays in focus and what stays out of focus. A shallow aperture such as f5.6 will create a blurred background, whereas an aperture setting of f22 will create a background that stays in focus. In order to set the shutter speed and aperture, you once again go into your camera settings and you go to each section of the camera settings, the shutter speed and aperture, and you can adjust it accordingly. Now on this camera, you can adjust shutter speed by using this dial, and you can do the same thing when you go to the aperture setting. You can adjust it by using a dial. Now that I have explained shutter speed and aperture, I will move on to exposure. Exposure is the final component photographers adjust when they are taking photos. Exposure controls whether the photo will end up looking lighter or darker after it is taken. Photographers adjust exposure due to the lighting situation in the area they are taking the photos. In order to adjust the exposure, the photographer must look through the viewfinder and line up the marker with the center of the viewfinder. Now that I have done this, we are ready to take a photo. So in conclusion, I have explained and demonstrated ISO. I've also explained and demonstrated how to set up shutter speed and aperture. And finally, I have explained and set up the exposure. Therefore, I believe that if you use a digital camera on the manual setting, you can create much more creative photos. Now go get creative. Are there any questions? Thank you for your time and attention.